Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your room and let the noise of the day fade into the background, I want you to imagine something simple. Imagine that history, the history we learned in school, the history written in books, the history displayed in museums, is only the surface, a thin layer, a gentle skin stretched over something much deeper. Beneath every empire, beneath every victory and every collapse, beneath every invention and every idea, there were always two stories. The one everyone saw, and the one almost no one ever noticed. Tonight, we're going to explore the second one. But before we begin, here's a small challenge for you, a secret of our own. Throughout this video, you will hear things most people have never been told, hidden connections, forgotten origins, and quiet moments that shaped the world in ways we rarely imagine. As you listen, I want you to notice something. At some point, there will be a moment in this story, one single moment, when something clicks for you. When something suddenly makes sense, when you hear a truth that feels like it was waiting for you all along. When that moment arrives, pause and ask yourself, do I want to miss the next chapter of this journey? If the answer is no, then that's your sign. Tap the subscribe button. It takes 1 second, but it makes sure the next hidden story finds its way to you. So, take a breath. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your mind drift into the ancient spaces between light and shadow. Because tonight, we are stepping into the forgotten corridors of history, into the secret societies they never wanted you to discover. From the moment humans began building the earliest cities, long before the idea of secret societies existed, people instinctively formed small circles that lived just slightly apart from everyone else. These were not conspirators or manipulators. They were simply the carriers of specialized knowledge in a world where knowledge itself was fragile. In the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, this instinct took its first structured form. As cities like Uruk and Babylon grew more complex, they needed order. Records of grain, contracts, laws, temple inventories, and diplomatic exchanges. Writing was invented to meet that need. But writing was difficult, time-consuming, and required training far beyond what an ordinary person could manage. From that difficulty emerged the scribes, men who pressed wedge-shaped cuneiform signs into clay tablets, and without ever intending to, became the gatekeepers of a city's memory. They spent their lives inside small tablet houses, places separate from the chaos of markets and fields. Their training developed into a disciplined tradition passed quietly from master to apprentice, not out of secrecy, but because the skill required precision and consistency. This natural separation created one of humanity's first inner groups, people whose duties demanded a level of literacy and discipline that set them apart from the rest of society. Their walls were not built of stone, but of difficulty. Few had the time, resources, or ability to join them. This separation, gentle yet profound, formed the seed of what later generations would interpret as secrecy. A similar pattern unfolded in Egypt, but with even stronger boundaries. Temples were not merely buildings of worship. They were the heart of Egyptian knowledge, repositories of astronomical data, medical knowledge, agricultural cycles, and ritual instruction. Priests of Amun or Ptah lived within temple precincts that ordinary people could not enter. Their lives followed a rhythm dictated by purification rituals, strict calendars, and duties invisible to most Egyptians. The knowledge they carried, how to perform rituals, how to interpret the floods of the Nile, how to read sacred writing, was protected not out of ambition, but out of necessity. A single mistake in a ritual was believed to disturb cosmic order, so temple knowledge stayed within carefully maintained circles. The structure resembled what we now imagine as a secret society, ranks, hierarchies, exclusive training, initiation into different levels of sacred knowledge. Yet, in truth, it was simply a functional division born from responsibility. As Mesopotamia and Egypt expanded, these small circles of knowledge holders became indispensable parts of society. And though they were not secret by intent, their nature promoted privacy. Few could read sacred texts, few understood the meaning of rituals, and fewer still had the discipline to dedicate their lives to mastering them. This created a quiet gap between the inner circle and the outer world, a gap later civilizations would inherit and reinterpret. Anthropologists call this functional stratification, the moment when societies stop operating as one unified body and begin dividing into layers based on purpose. And it is in this early stratification that we find the real origin of what would become secret societies, groups defined by specialized roles, confined spaces, and knowledge that could not easily be shared. These early circles shaped the psychological foundations of future societies. Humans learned that knowledge could be powerful, delicate, even dangerous, that it needed careful guardianship, that only those prepared for its weight could carry it, and that some truths make sense only within small communities. As centuries passed, these early knowledge circles evolved. Temples became bureaucratic centers, scribes became archivists, and specialized workers, stonecutters, physicians, astronomers, developed their own semi-closed worlds. Each profession required training, discipline, and inner communication systems outsiders would never fully grasp. And as these traditions passed through generations, a new cultural instinct developed, the belief that certain kinds of knowledge belonged to those who had earned it through dedication. Without writing any rules, without declaring themselves exclusive, humanity had created a pattern, an inner circle within the larger circle of society. These early forms were simple compared to the elaborate brotherhoods and mystical orders of later centuries, yet they carried the same essential traits: shared identity, specialized knowledge, selective membership, repeatable rituals, and protected spaces. Their goal was not control, but continuity. They ensured that humanity's fragile knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, healing, spiritual meaning, would survive through ages of drought, disaster, and war. And from these ancient foundations, every later secret society, from Greek philosophical circles to medieval guilds to modern intelligence agencies, would inherit something essential: the understanding that the deepest forms of knowledge often require small groups, quiet spaces, and humans willing to carry truths too complex for the wider world. In this sense, the first secret societies were not created. They emerged naturally as humanity's earliest response to complexity. They were less about darkness and more about preservation, less about ambition and more about survival. They were the first quiet rooms where civilization learned to think. When history turns toward Greece, the world often imagines open plazas filled with debate, philosophers standing in the sunlight, and a culture defined by public inquiry. But behind the face Greece showed the world was another landscape: quiet gardens, hidden courtyards, and small rooms where ideas were not shouted, but whispered, tested, and refined. These early intellectual circles were not closed because they wished for secrecy. They were closed because knowledge, to the Greeks, was a kind of transformation. A person had to be prepared before receiving it, the way a fragile seed needs shelter before it can face the wind. The Pythagoreans embodied this principle more than any other group of the ancient world. To them, numbers were not tools of calculation, but sacred keys that unlocked the architecture of the universe. They believed that harmony, proportion, and cosmic order could be found in every living thing. But these ideas required discipline to grasp, and so their life became ritual: strict diets, meditation, long periods of silence, and shared living. Some initiates were not even allowed to see Pythagoras. They listened from behind a veil, reminded symbolically that some truths were too sharp to touch without preparation. These practices created a cycle of learning based on readiness rather than exclusion. The Eleusinian mysteries formed an entirely different but equally powerful circle. Here, knowledge came through symbolic experience rather than logic. Participants traveled a ritual path of symbolic death and rebirth, encountering truths that could never be explained with words. Revealing the ritual was forbidden, not because it held political power, but because the meaning lived inside the experience itself. To describe it to someone unprepared would be like trying to hand them light. And so Greece developed two layers of knowledge, the outer world of reasoned debate and the inner world of transformative learning. This dual structure would become one of the most important templates for all future secret societies. Ideas were not hidden for advantage, they were sheltered until ready. When Greece was eventually absorbed into the expanding Roman world, these intellectual traditions did not disappear. They were reshaped by a civilization that prized discipline, loyalty, and political order. Rome approached secrecy differently. Where Greek circles hid fragile ideas, Rome hid fragile power. The Sodalates, oath-bound political alliances, grew from the need to maintain influence in the complex web of Roman elections, rivalries, and shifting allegiances. These groups acted as the silent machinery of the Republic, supporting candidates, coordinating votes, and enforcing agreements made behind closed doors. Their power did not lie in mysticism, but in loyalty. A man inside a Sodalatus owed allegiance to his circle before his own interests. This quiet network, invisible to the crowds of the Forum, shaped decisions long before they reached public view. As Rome expanded into a vast empire, the nature of these circles changed again. On distant frontiers where legions guarded borders far from the Senate's eye, soldiers formed collegia, tight-knit brotherhoods bound by shared duty. They created their own rules, customs, and internal support systems, becoming miniature societies within the larger imperial machine. These groups provided stability in isolated outposts and offered soldiers a sense of identity beyond the battlefield. Their cohesion made Rome's armies some of the most resilient in history. Meanwhile, another movement grew in the shadows of Roman religious life, the mystery religions. Mithraism, in particular, flourished among soldiers. Its underground temples, hidden rituals, and symbolic initiation ceremonies gave men a sense of meaning in a world where death was constant. Their gatherings resembled secret meetings, but their purpose was spiritual resilience, not political rebellion. Yet Rome, suspicious of any independent organization, saw these circles as potential threats. The empire tolerated much, but it feared groups that operated beyond imperial control. When crises shook the empire, economic collapse, invasions, internal decay, it was not Rome's grand structures that held society together, but these small groups, collegia, mystery cults, and loyalty circles that provided belonging and order. Across Greece and Rome, one thread remained constant. Whenever society became too complex, too pressured, or too fragile, humans instinctively formed small circles, places where ideas, identity, or power could survive without being crushed by the world outside. Greece taught humanity that some ideas require shelter. Rome taught humanity that some forms of power require discretion. Together, they shaped a model that would echo across centuries. The secret circle as both sanctuary and engine, a place where truth grows quietly until the world is ready to receive it. In their wake, the world learned a subtle lesson. Knowledge and influence often travel not in open squares, but through hidden corridors, carried by people who understand that silence can shape history just as powerfully as speech. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the fall was not a single moment, but a slow unraveling of the structures that had held life together. Roads deteriorated, markets crumbled, cities emptied, and the written knowledge that had once been copied with discipline scattered like ash in a storm. This was not darkness in the literal sense. It was the darkness that comes when memory fragments, and no one is left to gather the pieces. In this fragile world, monasteries became unexpected islands of preservation. Within stone walls and candle-lit scriptoriums, monks copied manuscripts word by word, their labor so slow that a single book might consume years of a human life. They saved what they could, but not everything could survive. Choices had to be made. Texts that aligned with religious purpose were prioritized. Others, scientific fragments, philosophical treatises, works too complex or too dangerous, were often abandoned, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Knowledge narrowed because the world was too broken to hold its full breadth. Yet even in this narrowing, invisible pathways formed. Wandering scholars, merchants traveling between distant ports, curious monks swapping notes with travelers. They carried small fragments of forgotten worlds. A Greek line scribbled in a margin, a copied page hidden inside a prayer book, a map folded between linens. These fragments moved quietly from person to person, forming a shadow network of knowledge long before universities existed. It was in this world of scattered learning that a new type of brotherhood arose, the Knight Templar. What began in 1119 as 9 knights seeking to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem grew into one of the most extraordinary institutions in medieval history. They were warriors, yet they lived like monks. They took vows of poverty and obedience, yet commanded armies. They owned no personal wealth, yet their order accumulated influence that rivaled kings. When the church granted them sanction and housed them in the area believed to be the site of Solomon's temple, something symbolic shifted. Their identity fused with a sacred narrative larger than any soldier could imagine. From that moment, they became more than an order. They became a myth in the making. Their discipline, reliability, and incorruptibility made them the trusted guardians of pilgrims' wealth. People who feared bandits and unstable kingdoms turned to the Templars, depositing their valuables with the order and receiving documents that allowed them to withdraw funds across a far-flung network. Without intending to, the Templars had created one of the earliest international financial systems, not a bank motivated by profit, but a network shaped by trust. Their commanderies communicated through coded letters. Their vaults were built like fortresses. Their internal accounting followed strict checks long before modern auditing existed. And because they lent to kings, stored royal treasuries, and managed financial operations across Europe and the Holy Land, they quietly accumulated power, not through armies, but through stability. But power, even when earned genuinely, casts a shadow. By the early 1300s, the Templars had become a paradox, an military order stronger than most armies, a financial institution more trusted than any kingdom, and an organization that answered not to kings, but to the Pope. This independence created unease, especially in France, where King Philip IV faced a collapsing economy and an unstable throne. He needed money, he needed authority, and in his eyes, the Templars held both. Unable to control them and unable to destroy them through open conflict, he turned to accusation, the oldest weapon of fear. Rumors were seeded. The Templars practiced strange rites, worshipped forbidden idols, insulted the cross. None of this needed proof. In an age of superstition and tension, doubt was enough. On Friday, October 13, 1307, now woven into legend, Philip ordered the sudden arrest of every Templar in France. Doors were broken before dawn. Knights were dragged from beds, shackled, interrogated, tortured until confessions were forced from them. Their silence, which had once symbolized discipline, was turned against them. The Pope, caught in the king's political trap, hesitated, and that hesitation allowed the purge to expand across Europe. The Templars fell not because of guilt, but because no human can withstand endless suffering. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, burned at the stake in 1314, proclaimed their innocence with his final breath, and with that breath stepped into legend. Yet the Templars did not vanish. In Portugal, the king transformed them into the Order of Christ, preserving their men, lands, and knowledge. In Scotland, excommunicated from Rome, they may have found refuge, merging with Masonry guilds, whose symbols would one day influence Freemasonry. Scattered traces, carved crosses, borrowed rituals, familiar structures, suggest that the Templars survived not through open defiance, but through quiet transformation, shedding their name but keeping their essence. And thus the Middle Ages gave the world two lessons. Knowledge survives in silence, and powerful circles survive by changing form. From monastic scribes to the warrior monks of the temple, the hidden currents of the era taught humanity that when the world becomes unstable, people retreat into smaller circles, guarding not power for its own sake, but the fragile threads of meaning that hold civilization together.
When the Templars disappeared from public life, they did not leave behind an empty space. Instead, they left behind an imprint, a way of thinking, a disciplined structure, a symbolic language that seeped quietly into the social foundations of Europe. The 14th and 15th centuries were not eras of stability, but of rebuilding. Europe was recovering from famine, plague, and war. Society fractured, then reformed in new shapes, and in this constantly shifting landscape, guilds became the threads holding everything together. Among these guilds, none held more influence than the stonemasons. They were builders not only of structures, but of memory, cathedrals, fortresses, towers, and bridges that would stand for centuries. Their work required precision, mathematics, engineering, and a deep understanding of the physical and symbolic universe. These craftsmen traveled from site to site, carrying with them a tradition of guarded knowledge, signs, gestures, coded phrases, and rituals used to verify skill and integrity. Their secrecy was not mystical, it was practical. In a world without written contracts or standardized training, a system of signs protected the craft from imposters and ensured that only those truly prepared could join their ranks. But over generations, something subtle happened. As Europe entered the Renaissance, knowledge flooded back into the world. Greek texts rediscovered, Arabic mathematics introduced, new philosophies emerging. Universities were still young and vulnerable to doctrinal control, and society punished unconventional thought harshly. So people who hungered for deeper learning began to gather quietly in places that offered both structure and protection. The stonemason lodges, already equipped with rituals, symbols, and a culture of discretion, became natural sanctuaries for thinkers, nobles, merchants, and scholars seeking a space to ponder ideas society was not yet ready to accept. Slowly, the guild shifted from purely practical instruction to symbolic teaching. The tools of the craft, compasses, squares, plumb lines, evolved into metaphors for inner balance and moral development. The three levels of the craft, apprentice, journeyman, and master, began to reflect stages of personal and philosophical growth. No one announced this transformation, it happened organically, as new voices entered the lodges and as the intellectual hunger of the Renaissance pushed against the limitations of the medieval world. By the 16th century, lodges in Scotland and England were no longer composed only of working stonemasons. They included men who did not build cathedrals, but who wished to build themselves. Scientists, poets, landowners, and men of reason drawn to a system that blended structure, symbolism, and quiet inquiry. These lodges carried the memory of guild discipline, but were slowly becoming philosophical societies. They would soon be known by a new name, Freemasons. Their influence expanded rapidly, not because they held secrets of world control, but because they offered something rare, a protected space for free thought in an era shadowed by religious conflict and political suspicion. In Freemasonry, a merchant and a noble could sit as equals. A scholar could debate a soldier. A man could reflect on morality without fear of church censure. And in these quiet rooms, with candles flickering against stone walls, the early seeds of the Enlightenment took root. By 1717, 4 London lodges united to form the Grand Lodge of England, marking the first official structure of Freemasonry as a philosophical and fraternal order. The world did not yet understand the significance of this moment, but within the next century, Freemasonry's spirit would quietly influence revolutions, reforms, and the spread of Enlightenment ideas, not through command or conspiracy, but through conversation, through the belief that reason, ethics, and equality could reshape societies. Yet as Freemasonry grew, suspicion followed. Outsiders saw rituals they did not understand, symbols without explanation, and gatherings that did not open their doors to the public. In an age of political turmoil, when revolutions swept through continents, people needed someone to blame. Into this atmosphere stepped a small Bavarian group that would become the most misunderstood society in history, the Illuminati. Founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, the Illuminati was less a secret order than nor a study circle, a gathering of young thinkers frustrated by the restrictions of church and state. Their goals were philosophical, not political, to promote education, virtue, and independent thought. But as they grew and mingled with Masonic lodges, rumors ignited. Their secrecy, combined with the explosive political climate of the late 18th century, allowed fear to distort reality. Governments banned them, documents were seized, and soon the group disappeared. But in vanishing, they became a myth, an easy explanation for every revolution, every shift in society, every tremor of change. The truth was simple. The Illuminati had been small, fragile, and short-lived. But the idea of them, an invisible hand guiding history, proved irresistible to the imagination. Thus, from the ashes of the Templars, through the hands of stonemasons, into the minds of Enlightenment thinkers, the secret society evolved into its modern mythic form. A blend of structure and story, truth and fear, philosophy and shadow. What these groups shared was not domination, but the desire to think in spaces too delicate for the public world. And humanity, as always, misread the quiet as conspiracy, when it was simply the sound of ideas growing in silence.
As Europe entered the industrial age, the world began to shift in ways that neither kings nor philosophers could fully predict. Steam engines roared, factories rose like iron forests, cities swelled with workers, and entire nations were reshaped by machines, railways, steel, and global commerce. In this new landscape, the old forms of secret societies, rooted in ritual, symbolism, and esoteric tradition, began to lose their central place. Not because secrecy disappeared, but because secrecy changed its purpose. Power no longer lived in ancient temples or symbolic lodges. It lived in boardrooms, universities, banks, and the invisible threads connecting a new class of elites. As wealth concentrated in the hands of industrialists, bankers, and political leaders, influence began to travel not through ritual, but through relationships, education, and social networks. At universities like Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, and Harvard, elite clubs and societies emerged, not seeking mystical knowledge, but forging bonds between young men destined to shape the modern world. These groups were exclusive, selective, and private, yet their secrecy had nothing to do with ancient mysteries. Instead, it reflected the simple truth that influence grows easiest in quiet rooms. In the United States, Skull and Bones at Yale became the most iconic example. Founded in 1832, its membership of only 15 students per year created a lifelong network that extended into finance, law, diplomacy, intelligence, and the presidency itself. Across the Atlantic, Britain had its own versions, woven into the gentlemen's clubs of London, places where aristocrats, diplomats, colonial officers, and wealthy industrialists discussed matters that newspapers would never print. These clubs were not temples, but their influence worked in similar ways. Private conversations shaping public outcomes, decisions made in silence because the world outside was too chaotic to understand their complexity. As the British Empire stretched across continents, networks like these formed a subtle architecture of influence, not designed for domination, but for coordination. The world was becoming too large for any single institution to manage. Instead, power passed through informal relationships built on trust. Trust formed in classrooms, drawing rooms, and quiet dinners among people who recognized each other as members of the same invisible circle. Meanwhile, the ideas of Cecil Rhodes took these networks a step further. His scholarships, meant to bring talented young people to Oxford, created a cross-continental generation of leaders who shared similar values and who would later shape policies in their own countries. This was not a secret society, but it functioned with the same long-term coherence: shared education, shared worldview, shared instinct. The roundtable groups that followed were privately organized but not clandestine. Circles of thinkers, journalists, and policymakers discussing how to maintain stability in an increasingly turbulent world. By the late 19th century, influence had taken on a new form. No rituals, no grand masters, no temples. Just connections, dense, subtle, durable. And when the 20th century arrived, those connections were tested in ways that would redefine the meaning of secrecy. When World War I erupted, modern warfare revealed a truth the ancient world had never faced. Power was no longer only physical. It lived in information, propaganda, intelligence, and the ability to anticipate an enemy's movements. Governments suddenly needed linguists, historians, mathematicians, journalists, people who could analyze, translate, persuade, decode. And where did these people come from? The same universities, clubs, and elite networks that had formed decades earlier. Men who once debated ideas in private societies now found themselves recruited into the war's hidden machinery. In Britain, scholars from Oxford and Cambridge helped build early intelligence networks and propaganda offices. In the United States, as it entered the war, similar patterns emerged. Because influence already flowed quietly along educational and social lines, wartime intelligence simply tapped into those lines. After the war, the world entered a period of uneasy peace. Economies trembled, ideologies clashed, revolutions erupted, and society struggled to recover from the trauma. In this fragile environment, elites continued meeting in discreet settings, not to plot domination, but because the public sphere was too unstable for honest dialogue. Then World War II arrived, and secrecy transformed once again, not into ritual, but into strategy. Intelligence services expanded dramatically. Scholars vanished into code-breaking centers like Bletchley Park. American thinkers from Yale, Harvard, and Princeton filled the newly formed OSS, which would later become the CIA. These people were not members of secret societies. They were members of networks, educated, analytical, discreet. They were chosen because they could be trusted with silence. War forced every nation to understand that information itself was now the world's most powerful secret. And as the war ended, those who had served in these hidden roles carried their instincts into peacetime. They entered think tanks, diplomatic posts, financial institutions, universities, and the emerging intelligence agencies of the Cold War. Thus, the modern world inherited a new form of secrecy, not mystical, not symbolic, but practical. A secrecy built from knowledge, data, analysis, and global coordination. Elite networks replaced ancient rituals because the world itself had grown too complex for anything else. And as humanity stepped into the atomic age, these networks would soon form the foundation of the next generation of secret societies, the ones shaped not by symbols carved in stone, but by information flowing across continents faster than anyone could comprehend. As the world stepped into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the old image of secret societies, hooded figures, candlelit chambers, cryptic symbols etched into stone, faded into the background like a distant myth. In their place rose something quieter, more technical, and infinitely more difficult to see. A world defined not by hidden rituals, but by hidden information. Power shifted from cloisters and lodges into think tanks, intelligence agencies, financial systems, private institutions, and eventually into the invisible logic of digital networks. And although these modern structures were nothing like the secret societies of the ancient world, they carried the same fundamental trait: the power to influence the world from spaces the public rarely glimpsed. After World War II, the Cold War reshaped the landscape of secrecy entirely. The rise of the CIA in the United States, MI6 in Britain, and the KGB in the Soviet Union marked a transformation of secrecy from ritual to strategy. In these institutions, secrecy was not symbolic, it was essential. Analysts pored over intercepted signals, decoded messages, satellite images, political reports, and economic data. They shaped decisions that could determine peace or war, yet their names were often unknown even to their own neighbors. They formed a new kind of hidden circle, not bound by oaths, but by classification, not united by symbols, but by access to information too sensitive for the world to see. At the same time, think tanks like Rand, Chatham House, Brookings, and others emerged as quiet engines of global policy. These groups did not parade their influence. They worked in conference rooms behind plain doors, where experts debated nuclear deterrence, economic stability, geopolitical risks, and technological transformation. They had no ceremonies, no ancient robes, no altar stones, only white papers, projections, and analyses that quietly shaped national strategies. Then came the Bilderberg Group, founded in 1954 and immediately wrapped in public suspicion because of its silence. Its purpose was simple: to create a private space where leaders, scholars, business figures, and journalists from both sides of the Atlantic could speak openly without political consequences. But in a world accustomed to transparency, closed doors were enough to ignite imagination. The more discreet such organizations were, the more the world doubted them. Yet their influence came not from hidden agendas, but from the fact that modern societies had grown too complex to make sense of in public arenas. Honest conversations required privacy, or the fragile world order would crack under constant misinterpretation. As globalization intensified, financial networks became the new corridors of unseen power. International banking systems, multinational corporations, rating agencies, trade alliances, central banks — these entities coordinated trillions of dollars with decisions made in meeting rooms the public never saw. Not because they sought secrecy, but because the technical nature of their work demanded quiet precision. When financial crises threatened entire continents, it was analysts and policymakers behind the scenes, not kings or generals, who shaped the outcome. In the 21st century, secrecy changed again, taking on a form more pervasive than any brotherhood ever imagined. The rise of the internet created a new terrain, a digital world where data replaced ritual, servers replaced chambers, and algorithms replaced coded handshakes. The guardians of this world were not monks, knights, or philosophers, but engineers, programmers, cryptographers, and cybersecurity experts whose work determined the flow of information for billions of people. Social media algorithms began shaping what humanity sees, thinks, buys, and votes for. Artificial intelligence learned patterns of human behavior with frightening accuracy. Corporations amassed databases larger than anything governments had ever possessed in history. And for the first time, the most powerful secret societies of the world were not human groups at all. They were systems, invisible, automated, constantly learning. The modern secret society is a team of engineers deciding how digital attention works, a research group analyzing future biological risks, a handful of data scientists adjusting an algorithm that shapes global behavior, a group of policy advisors discussing cyber warfare strategies in rooms without cameras, or an AI ethics board determining what should or should not exist in the world of tomorrow. These groups do not hide themselves, but the public cannot see them clearly because the complexity of their work forms a natural wall around them, just as ancient rituals once did. And beneath this complexity lies a deeper truth. Humanity never stopped forming small circles. We only changed their tools. From ancient scribes to Egyptian priests, from Greek initiates to Roman sodalities, from Templar knights to Masonic thinkers, from Enlightenment circles to elite academic networks, from wartime intelligence to digital technologists, the pattern remains the same. When a world becomes too large, too fast, too loud, or too dangerous, humans instinctively create small, focused communities to hold what cannot be held in the open. Today's world is shaped not by conspiracy, but by complexity, not by shadows on stone walls, but by decisions made in virtual spaces, not by hidden handshakes, but by hidden code. And in this new landscape, the question is no longer who controls the world, but rather who understands it well enough to influence it quietly. The secret societies of the modern age are no longer defined by secrecy itself. They are defined by silence, the silence of data centers, of encrypted channels, of conference rooms where global challenges are discussed with a responsibility too heavy for the public stage. And as humanity moves deeper into the digital future, one truth remains unchanged. Whenever the world becomes overwhelming, people will continue to form small circles. Circles that protect knowledge, guide decisions, and hold the fragile threads of civilization together, just as they have since the very beginning of history.
And now, as our journey through hidden history slowly comes to a close, take a moment just to notice how you feel. You began this video with a world you thought you understood, but now the map looks different. The shadows are clearer. The spaces between events feel alive. You've walked through ancient temples, whispered halls, quiet lodges, wartime strategy rooms, and even the silent circuitry of the modern world. You now see the invisible threads most people will never notice. And here's the strange part. If one video can shift your perspective this much, imagine what the next one could do. Before you leave, here's a small mental experiment. Think back to a single moment in this video, the one that stayed with you the most. Hold it for a second. If that moment made you curious, if it opened a door inside your mind, then that is your sign, a sign that you're meant to continue this journey with us. So don't leave the story halfway. Tap subscribe so the next hidden chapter finds you the moment it's uncovered. Until then, rest well, sleep deeply, and remember, the world is always carrying more secrets than it shows.